Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we look into the dark corners of two of the 20th century's most towering figures, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. In the second half of our show, retired private banker David Locke, author of No More Champagne, Churchill and His Money, profiles this larger-than-life reckless gambler and abysmal stock speculator who spent his life dodging both creditors and the taxman. Up first, we're pleased to welcome Burt Folsom, professor of history at Hillsdale College and author of New Deal or Raw Deal, How FDR's Economic Legacy Has Damaged America. Burt, welcome to the show.
Bill, it's good to be with you today.
Burt, every American school kid for the past 70 years has been raised on the narrative that Herbert Hoover's laissez-faire economic policies caused the Great Depression and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal cured it. Now, I understand you're a contrarian on that, and I ask you on the show not for your analysis or recitation of unemployment and GDP figures, but to share some stories from those days that most people have never heard. Mired as we are in the current Great Recession, these stories are as relevant today as ever. So start off by taking us back to the tumultuous times leading up to the stock market crash in 1929, a full 3 years before FDR was elected to his first term. What did Herbert Hoover and Congress actually do when the Roaring Twenties came to an abrupt end?
Well, Herbert Hoover did exactly the opposite in responding to crisis of what Warren Harding and President Coolidge did. President Harding and President Coolidge both cut federal spending. They cut tax rates. They had balanced budgets every year of the 1920s. In fact, we had surpluses every year. The end result was huge economic growth, people spending their own money instead of government spending money. Calvin Coolidge had the lowest unemployment rate and inflation rate combined of any president since the statistics have been computed. So that was their response to the end of World War I and the recession that came after that war. Now we have 1929, about a decade later. Hoover is in, and Hoover is responding to a crisis, by the way, which was largely created by government. The Federal Reserve increased interest rates, and then Hoover responded with a large federal farm board program, that is, huge spending on subsidies to wheat and cotton farmers.
Well, he was a great engineer. Isn't that why he was elected? He was able to fix all sorts of problems?
Well, he advertised himself as a Mr. Fix-It. In fact, he said poverty is about ready to disappear in the United States. He had had success as an engineer. But it's one thing to engineer in the private sector and another thing to use the federal government to intervene in the American economy. It simply didn't work. He had a bailout program called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It was a failure. He had a tariff that was the highest tariff in United States history. That created problems because it was hard for Americans to import foreign items that they needed. And foreign countries retaliated against us by refusing to buy our exports, so that the auto industry, which was the strongest in the world, ended up really cutting down the sales of cars we had. We sold over 5 million cars in 1929. We were at about 1.5 million 4 years later.
But he jacked up government spending, he jacked up government programs, he jacked up taxes, all the things that FDR ended up doing, and yet historians claim that he was laissez-faire?
No. What it is Harding and Coolidge were laissez-faire. Hoover and Roosevelt were spenders.
Birds of a feather.
Yes. Now, Roosevelt was more so than Hoover. Roosevelt was Hoover on steroids. But the two, you have to put Hoover and Roosevelt together and then put Harding and Coolidge together. And when you do that, you have consistent groups that had different sets of ideas. The ideas of Harding and Coolidge of increasing free enterprise and increasing people's control of their money, that worked. The big spending ideas did not work.
Well, FDR made some rather extraordinary promises during his campaign for election in 1932, and particularly in light of the policies he actually followed. What were those promises?
Well, he promised to balance the federal budget. He knew that people would like to hear that. In fact, he promised that he would only appoint people to his cabinet and into his administration who would go along with the Democratic platform, the Democratic Party platform, which promised a 25% cut in federal spending.
Wow. So people did not get what they asked for.
No. He increased federal spending every year. In fact, before his second term was over, he had more than doubled the whole national debt. In other words, if you look at all the debt that the United States accrued in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Civil War, which was huge, and World War I, and all the other spending, and put that on one side, and then put 7 years of Franklin Roosevelt on the other side, we had more spending under Roosevelt than all those others combined. And at the end of the seventh year, we had about 19% unemployment.
FDR's signature first-term accomplishment was the passage of the NRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act. Exactly what did that empower the federal government to do?
The federal government was approving industries setting prices for products that they would sell.
As a cartel.
About 400 to 500 industries got the privilege of selling their own products that they were making for the price they wanted to sell it for.
So let's go through some examples. Pursuant to the NRA, the Roosevelt administration, in conjunction with the leading tire manufacturers, crafted something called the Retail Tire Code. What was that?
That allowed the tire manufacturers to set a fixed price for every tire that was sold. What I'm saying is no one could give a discount below that price.
And what happened if a tire manufacturer maybe was more efficient or maybe wanted to get some market share? What happened to a manufacturer who sold for less than that price?
You would go to jail. You would be liable. You might get off at first with a warning, but if you persisted, you would go to jail.
I mean, Henry Ford is lauded by historians for paying his workers the highest wages in the auto industry, but I understand he refused to sign the NRA code and jack up his car prices. How did FDR get him to knuckle under?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Henry Ford made the statement about the National Recovery Act, the NRA. We can't live up to it, or we'd have to live down to it. In other words, Ford was already paying his workers tremendous wages. He set the standard for high wages.
Right.
And he said, I'm not going to sign any code and have the federal government dictating what I do or do not charge for any product. And they were reluctant to put Ford in jail. They did put some people in jail. They were reluctant to do it with Ford. And so what they did was the federal government refused to buy any product that Ford was selling, which is to say when the Ford Motor Company made bids on federal contracts for, say, the Civilian Conservation Corps or any other federal agency, they simply took the next best bid, which meant they paid more money for trucks and cars than they otherwise would have in order to punish Henry Ford.
Perhaps more humorous was the NRA Cleaners and Dryer Code, setting prices for everybody in the dry cleaning business. What happened when a Jersey City dry cleaner insisted on charging 35 cents instead of the minimum legal 40 cents to press a pair of pants?
The dry cleaners set a rule that you had to charge 40 cents to press a pair of pants. Jacob Maged was in Jersey City, and he was not on the main street. He was an immigrant, and he was off the main street because he couldn't afford the high rents of the main street. In the past, he had been charging less in order to get people to go a couple blocks out of their way to come to his cleaners. Well, when they said you have to charge 40 cents, he had to raise his price. Well, he lost his business, so he went back to charging 35 cents to press a pair of pants. And he had to stand trial and was sentenced to a jail sentence.
Wow.
And that was the result of the dry cleaners code.
And you never hear about this in the history books, at least when you're in elementary school or in high school.
Right. I think they ought to have a monument to him. They did apparently give him a reprieve of sorts, but they demanded that he charge 40 cents. He said, I'm going out of business charging 40 cents to press a pair of pants.
It ultimately took a bunch of kosher chickens to provide the Supreme Court case that overturned the NRA in 1935. Tell us about that. Yeah,
it's sometimes called the sick chicken case, the Schechter case. Yeah. The idea here is that you had to charge the same amount for chickens, and they were kosher chickens. But some people, they said, okay. They didn't like that they couldn't get a discount, maybe, which was the case before the NRA. But what happened then was that the people buying the chickens wanted to look and see what chicken they were buying.
These were live chickens.
Yeah, they wanted to be sure it was a healthy-looking chicken.
Yep.
And so the code that was set up that the federal government approved said that they didn't like the idea of people picking their own chickens, because what would happen is you'd pick a good chicken and the only chickens left at the end of the day would be
scrawny ones.
would be sick-looking chickens, and they couldn't sell them. So the rule that was passed that the NRA supported was that you had to randomly reach in and pick a chicken.
What did the Supreme Court make of that?
Well, the defenders of this government intervention were making the case to the Supreme Court that they had to randomly pick them or they might pick all the good ones. And so Justice Sutherland was saying, well, what happens if all the chickens run to the other side of the coop? And there was just laughter in the Supreme Court. And you could see that the justices were not impressed with the constitutionality of a law that said that people couldn't pick their own chickens that they wanted to buy, and that the price of the chicken had to be absolutely set.
And so the NRA went down, and FDR declared war on the Supreme Court.
Yes, 9-0. It was a 9-0 case.
Yep.
Unanimously, the National Recovery Act was struck down.
So, Burt, the farm economy was in a bad way when FDR came to power, and he passed something called the Agricultural Adjustment Act. It was a key element of the New Deal. How did it work?
The Agricultural Adjustment Act was a method of paying farmers not to produce. That was one of the features of it. You would be paid not to produce. And you might think, well, why should you be paid not to produce? And the answer is that the farmers were producing so much in the way of crops, wheat, cotton, whatever, that the prices were going down. And so they thought, here's the way to raise prices. By the way, this idea could only have been developed by a college professor. It was a Harvard College professor, no less. And the idea was to reduce the overproduction that existed. Instead of having people just go off the farm and go into other occupations and then reduce supply that way, that you have people paid not to produce, and that would reduce production. And also, because they're being paid not to produce, that would be a benefit to the farmers, and then the prices would rise as well.
But wasn't there a lot of hunger during that time, too? What did that do to the people on the other end of this equation?
It raised the prices of their food and made them hungrier.
I understand that they also put 100,000 farm inspectors on the government payroll to enforce these laws. Didn't that help ease unemployment?
The 100,000 inspectors who went to, because, see, they had to hire people to make sure people were cutting back their production because they were paid not to produce on the land they were taking out of circulation. So they had to bring agricultural inspectors to make sure that people were not producing on the land. And in fact, the farmers often were producing on the land, and they would often bribe the inspectors to turn and look the other way. So some of the money the government was paying to the farmers not to produce was then being paid to the inspectors to look the other way, paid as bribes.
So given all the hardship, there was a lot of migration. Everybody's read Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. What was FDR's resettlement administration all about?
The resettlement administration was to try to take people out of areas that might be overpopulated and bring them to areas that were maybe underpopulated, and then have the resettled people make a living in the new place. But often the people didn't have the talent, the resettled people, to make a living under the new environment, and the resettlement administration was a total failure.
Didn't Eleanor Roosevelt herself have a little project in this area called Annandale?
Yeah, the houses, unfortunately, apparently didn't fit on the slabs that were the foundation slabs, and so that was very unsuccessful. The resettlement administration had virtually no success that they could point to. It was simply an expenditure of funds to move people around. You know, the interesting thing is that people have been moving, Bill, all throughout American history, but when someone moves, say, as in the Steinbeck example that you cited, Grapes of Wrath, when somebody goes from Oklahoma to California, you're making a rational move. You're going from a place that's not working to a place you think might work better. With the resettlement administration, when you move people into Alaska or other places that they may not really be fitted for, that doesn't work as well.
Probably FDR's biggest make-work project was called the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, and it's still held up by many contemporary politicians as a model for putting the unemployed back to work. Take us inside how the massive amount of spending was actually allocated.
The WPA was Roosevelt's most famous program. And the idea here is that you have people who are unemployed or underemployed, and you create jobs building roads, perhaps building schools or other buildings, and put them to work. Of course, again, that assumes that these people are competent to do the jobs. What we found, not only was there poor quality construction often done, not all the time, I want to make clear, but often the construction was very poor, the road, for example, but that it was very slowly done because the people wanted to be able to stretch out the work as long as they could and get paid for it. but it was politicized, Bill. That's the key point. The communities that received the roads or the allocation of money for roads were those who buckled under to Franklin Roosevelt. He used that allocation money to give to congressmen and others who would back his New Deal program.
So it was payola on a large scale.
Yes, it was. And I have in the book New Deal or Raw Deal, I give several examples of county commissioners and others who say, let's use these funds to reinforce the prosperity of the New Deal and elect Democrats to office.
Some things never change.
No, but see, that's how the big program went right from the start. In other words, the theory is you have unemployed people, we have the federal government that will give money to employ them, and then that will be a boon to society. Right from the start, right from the get-go, the first year of the program, it was a political tool by Roosevelt to increase the power of the Democratic Party.
And it worked quite well. He did get elected 4 times.
It worked tremendously well. He didn't just get elected 4 times, Bill. Your statement is correct. The first time he ran for re-election, right after the WPA came into being, he carried every state in the Union except for 2. He won the Electoral College 523-8.
Despite the fact that unemployment hadn't gone down.
Correct. It had gone down slightly, but it was still almost 14-15%.
Wow.
Nobody runs for re-election with 14 to 15% unemployment and calls that success. But we had the possibility that many voters saw of getting free government money, and that changed the dynamics of American politics.
Speaking of which, fomenting class warfare was a major tool in FDR's political arsenal, much as it is today.
Yes.
Describe how his income tax policies worked.
Class warfare is very important, and if you think of the logic, you can see it. If you have, say, a millionaire on one hand, and you have, say, 50 people with low incomes on the other hand, you can take that millionaire, and if you can tax him more than half of his income, say $500,000, you can then give $10,000 each to those 50 people who don't have as much.
And you've won the election 50-1.
Right, and then look at all the votes you get. So class warfare is always going to follow these kinds of government programs. What we find is that Roosevelt took the tax rate and got the maximum rate. He did this in 1935, got the maximum rate up to 79%.
Wow.
Then in the 1940s, he raised it even higher. And when he died, the tax rate was 94% on all income earned over $200,000.
During the Great Depression, much like today, many businesses were reluctant to invest. What did FDR do to pry money out of businesses that wouldn't spend it?
Yeah, the idea was that the government knows how to spend corporate dollars better than the corporations do. We're talking now about investment, not so much taxation. The idea here was that corporations that held back funds, and there are all sorts of reasons why you might not reinvest all the money that comes in, but they said all money that the corporations take in that isn't spent is subject to a special undistributed profits tax. So it forced corporations to pay money out either in salaries or dividends rather than in reinvestment to try to find and improve new products.
And what impact did that have on the economy?
Well, it not only had a negative impact on the economy from a standpoint of invention and improvement of products, but it made the corporate presidents and corporate leaders very afraid to do any kind of reinvestment at all because the government would be taking all, not only through regular income taxation, but through the undistributed profits tax, would be taking what they earn. So it really stifled economic growth.
FDR was perhaps the first president to truly weaponize IRS audits. How did that policy work?
Right. Even his own son, Elliot, said, my father was the first to use the IRS as a political weapon. And the IRS was a method to go after rich people who are hostile to you. And, of course, you protect rich people who are not hostile to you so that, for example, you had the mayor of Chicago was in trouble with the IRS, and that was not going to work against him because he was a Democrat. Lyndon Johnson, who got in trouble with the IRS, also was protected by Franklin Roosevelt because these were Democrats and friends. But people who were Republicans who actively opposed him, Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of Treasury under Coolidge and Harding, He was prosecuted. They found him really not guilty, but he was prosecuted nonetheless, and that was used in the political arena to help gain the Democrats' votes. Mo Annenberg, who was the editor of and publisher of the Philadelphia Inquirer, he opposed FDR and criticized Roosevelt. Roosevelt felt he had to carry Pennsylvania. He ended up putting Mo Annenberg in prison for an income tax violation. So the IRS is used as a political weapon. Go after your enemies, protect your friends.
Looking at it economically, when we come to 1939, the eve of war, where did we stand with unemployment and GDP?
In 1939, at one point, we had over 20% unemployment. If you look at that in numerical terms, we had about identical number of people unemployed in 1939 as we did in 1932 and 33. All of this spending, all of these programs did not reduce unemployment, except maybe the slightest bit. And the reason there was no productive impact of all of that money spent is because it was all spent for political purposes. It did not restore the economic base of the country. It merely rewarded money to friends and was taken from enemies who Roosevelt wished to punish.
So if the New Deal didn't end the Great Depression, what did?
What did was telling corporate leaders and businessmen that they could keep much of what they produced and encourage them to expand their businesses.
And when did this happen?
Some people say World War II got us out of the Great Depression, but the problem there is that you simply took about 12 million people, put them in the military, and then used deficit spending to pay for them in the military. The question then is, what's going to happen after the war when those 12 million people come back? And that was going to be the big issue. Roosevelt and Truman, too, thought that there would be massive unemployment when they returned. That was not the case because the Republican Congress and the Democrats helped with this, too, in 1945, 1946, reduced the income tax and reduced the corporate tax from 90% to 38%. When we had those kinds of reductions, we were telling corporations, we were telling individuals, you can keep most of what you earn, and we get the expansion of the American economy. I'm speaking about Xerox and copy machines, Chester Carlson, who founded Xerox. I'm speaking of television, ultimately Ray Kroc and McDonald's. All of these industries come in the decade after World War II, and we told people you get to keep what you earn, and we had an expansion of the American economy.
So the New Deal was ended, the economy took off.
Correct.
Given the facts, what accounts for the lasting legend of the success of the New Deal and repeated attempts to emulate it every time there's another economic downturn?
Bill, you're right. We didn't learn the lesson. And I think part of it is the bias of the historians. The historians like Roosevelt because he hired lots of academic people and he gave power to bureaucrats, or many of which were academics, over the economy instead of entrepreneurs. And so there's a bias in the historical profession. Beyond that, Henry Hazlitt gets into this in his wonderful book, Economics in One Lesson. Hazlitt makes the point, people look at what is seen and not what is unseen. When you take tax money and you spend it, what you don't see is all the wonderful things people would have done with that money had they been allowed to keep it.
The things that didn't happen.
Right. What they do see is the bridge or the road that was built with the tax dollars. So it gives the appearance that the government spending created the bridge or created the road. Of course, those people working for the government did build the road or did build the bridge, but there were things that could have been done with that money that might have been just as economically valuable if the government had not taken the money. You don't see it because it was never built, because the dollars were taken by the government.
Burt, it's always delightful to take a romp through history with you. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Bill, it was good to be with you. Thank you.
That was Hillsdale professor Burt Folsom, author of New Deal or Raw Deal, How FDR's Economic Legacy Has Damaged America, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. You can check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. Please stop by RealClearRadio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Ahead, retired private banker David Locke, author of No More Champagne, Churchill and His Money, profiles the harrowing personal financial life of this towering figure. Stay tuned.